and the eyes of all the people in the synagogue were upon him. I feel it. So some might be interested in knowing that last night, I believe it was the Charlotte Hornets beat the New Orleans, I might even get the teams mixed up, 123-92. That's what I thought. No response. Means nothing to you. Not very good news. Who cares? Unless you're in New Orleans. This morning we want to talk about the message that Jesus brought. The message as he read from the scrolls from the prophet Isaiah, where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." Well, good news really depends on not just who's giving it, who's bringing it, but even more so, who's listening to it. And we may think that what we have is good news, but those who hear it may be interpreting it very, very differently from how we would understand it. And so I imagine that if we were to understand the poor, then we need to, before we bring good news to them, we need to ask ourselves, just what is good news to the poor? There are many who have written in commentaries that good news to the poor was about we are sinners, but Jesus has died for us and has given us new life. But sometimes they include that part about the poor are sinners and put an emphasis on that part, making those who are receiving the message feeling guilty and wondering, what have I done? There are those that want to take the message how they understand it. And so this morning what we want to do is we want to look at the passage a bit and see how Jesus understood it as he was reading words that had been written hundreds of years before him. And there, as he read the words, how he interpreted them in his own mind. Sorry, my notes just got mixed up here, and there we are. What was the Hebrew mind thinking of when Isaiah wrote those words? The word basar, forgive me for those that might know Hebrew far more than me, is found 21 times in the Old Testament. And there it is in reference to bearing good news, to bear tidings, to preach, to show forth, to gladden with good news, that the good news, that the message that should be brought is one that should gladden the hearts, that should bring joy to the hearer of it. As we would read in Isaiah 52, verse 7, how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who proclaim peace, who proclaim salvation, who say to Zion, your God reigns. It's a message of good news. It says that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor. Here the word for poor is anav, used 26 times in the Old Testament. However, there are 5 or 6 other words that are used to describe, in fact, maybe more, to describe the poor in the Old Testament. Some say there are over 2,000 references to the poor. And those who are being described as the poor would be the widows, the orphans, the elderly, the oppressed, aliens, foreigners, refugees in the land, subsistence farmers, day workers, indentured slaves, beggars, and the chronically sick. They're the ones who are being referred to as the poor. The poor, the humble, the afflicted, the meek. When they were understanding this, they remembered the Torah laws. 613 different laws are recorded in the Old Testament. Over 100 of those laws are in reference to protect the rights of the poor themselves. And so God has a desire to see the care for the poor, even in the laws. When we come to the Old Testament history books, we read stories there such as Ruth and Naomi, two widows coming back, returning to their land. And there they are gleaning, in particular Ruth is gleaning in the fields of Boaz, the kinsman. And Boaz, knowing the Old Testament laws, says to his workers, make sure you leave a little bit extra grain when you're harvesting. Leave it for those in particular. He's thinking about Ruth. But he understood because that was the desire of God in the laws that were given in the Old Testament. And so he was fulfilling it with gladness. The basic thought of the Torah is that God is the protector and defender of the poor, protecting the rights of the poor. We remember the story of Nathan going to David and telling him a parable of a rich man who had many sheep, went in and had a visitor come in, and he rather than slaughtering one of his own, he went and took the one precious lamb belonging to the poor farmer and slaughtered that and gave. And David, in his righteous anger, said, who is that man? Let us bring him to justice. And Nathan points out to him, you are that man. As we read further through the Old Testament and we come to the wisdom literature, we read through the Psalms and we read through Proverbs, and there it again describes the desire, the necessity of taking care of the poor, and that God is the one who is watching out and caring for them. That is a part of their life. When we get to the prophets, we read in Isaiah just before this passage that we're looking at, and he writes, is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin? All in reference to the true worship of fasting. Or Micah chapter 6:8, he has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what is it that the Lord requires of you? But to all of a sudden my mind went blank. But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And yet Jesus is reading in the New Testament period, and there, as he is ministering in around the Galilee region, he knows the stories of people. He knows what's going on. He knows who has what and who doesn't have what. Maybe he knew the story of Mary, his mother, as she sang the Magnificat. He has lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things. Maybe he heard the stories of the shepherds who were out in the fields. The angels spoke to them. I bring you good news of great joy, the lowly shepherds. If not, he certainly knew the stories of the blind beggars that he met. He knew of the 10 lepers. He knew the woman bleeding for 12 years. He knew the feeding of the 5 and the 4,000 because he was the one who brought healing. He is the one who created the miracles that we repeat today. In the book of Acts, in chapter 6, the disciples are called to bring justice because the Greek widows are not receiving as much as the Jewish widows. And there's call for justice, and they are to act upon that, and they bring good news as they bring justice. And James writes, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. And so if we understand this teaching that is broad throughout all of Scripture, we begin to understand that maybe we need to rethink what we mean by good news to the poor, because God has a certain understanding of what he means when he talks about good news to the poor. The poor want to hear good news. But when you're hungry, as James says, and without clothing, you don't need to hear, "Be blessed and go on your way." What kind of religion is that, James writes? If I'm hungry, good news is I'm going to eat. If I need clothing, the good news is I'm going to be provided with clothing. The last couple of weeks has been cold. And twice in the last 2 weeks, and I've only been coming in part-time recently, after the services of Common Table has been over, people have come to the door. One man, as it was snowing out, he was wearing sandals and wet socks and no jacket. And he didn't ask for clothing. He said, "I'm hungry. Do you have any sandwiches left over?" And the response is, "But your feet are wet and it's snowing outside and you're wearing sandals." But his simple question is, "Do you have sandwiches?" I got him sandwiches. And then I went and got him sandals or a pair of winter boots that we happened to have donated, and socks and a jacket. And he left them. Because good news for him at that particular moment, even though you and I are wondering why didn't he take them, for him, all he was interested in was getting the sandwiches. And so we need to listen. In the late 80s, I was with Yonge Street Mission, and in particular at the branch of Evergreen. We were reaching out to the street youth population, and there was like a great spiritual awakening among them, so much so that we decided we need to start a church for them, specifically for them. And out of that, I was called to be the first pastor at that church. And we had two young men, Rob and Victor, and they were heavily involved in the street culture, and they knew what was going on. And there was a murder that took place. And the murder happened in this long abandoned building at Parliament and Front Street, a big long building that was used for gas filtration, but had been empty for about 40 or 50 years. The building had been taken over by the squatters, the street-involved youth, and in particular those who were running most of the drugs on Yonge Street. It was a dangerous place. It was not safe for anybody, and the police refused to go in there. And Rob knew that the boyfriend of the woman that was killed was living there, and he was one of the dealers. And they said to me, "Bill, we need to go and do what you call that pastoral visiting kind of thing. We need to go take care of him." And I didn't know what exactly we were getting into. But we walked through the weeds and through a fence. There was a big hole in the fence, and we went into this big abandoned building. And as we went in through the light that was getting through the broken windows, I could see the different ones who had their own encampments within this huge building. And they're all watching because I didn't look like them. I must have looked like a police officer. And they were checking out where I was going. And Rob and Victor brought me to this young man. And he said to me, he looked me up and down, he said, "You're the priest?" And I said, "Yep." And he says, "I don't know what you're doing here. Not even God comes here. It's too dangerous." And I said, "Well, this is all you've got today." And there in the midst of listening to him talk about the murder and the pain that he was going through, it wasn't about the murder. It was about the loss of the one that he loved. And for about 15, 20 minutes, we listened to his story. We didn't know what to say, but we left. And we talked afterwards, and we wondered, maybe this is the only time that God experienced the presence, or that the young man and others there experienced the presence of God for that moment in their life. Good news was brought that day. And good news continues to happen. We had our Christmas in the City concert just a few weeks ago, about 5 weeks ago. And at that concert, I was at the back with one of the Common Table community members, and we were enjoying the concert. And Ann Keys came to me and said, "Bill, we've got a little issue here. There's someone that we might need some help with." And I took a glance over at the back door, and there, sure enough, was a young man who obviously had been hospitalized and had decided it was time to leave. And he left simply with the hospital gown and a blanket. And by the time I took the 12 steps to get over to where he was, Susan Graham Walker and Sharon Kirby were already heading downstairs to get him clothing, and David Burt was there talking with him gently and making him feel at home and relaxed. Good news happened at Christmas in the City concert. 2 weeks ago, I was standing outside and I was talking to one of the gentlemen that comes in. And out of the blue, he said to me, good news happens here. And I was already starting to prepare, and I thought, what do you mean by good news? He said, you wouldn't believe the number of people that come in here lonely and leave with a friend. That in his understanding of good news, friendship was what was important, not the meals. We have another gentleman that comes in pretty well every day. And behind his back, we call him the Common Table evangelist. Because at least once a week, he brings in a stranger that he's met on the street and brings them in and tells us, this is Jake. Jake is new here. Make him feel welcome. And then he walks away. He also lives out on the streets up by St. Clair and Yonge. And there's a bagel shop up there somewhere. And he's gotten to know the owner of the bagel shop and has told the owner of the bagel shop about Common Table. And so every so often now, he comes down from St. Clair with a big bag of bagels over his shoulders because he's got the owner to donate to us. But he has a reputation on the street that he's got to keep. And so he always says to us, if you tell anybody what all this good that I'm doing, I'll kill you. Good news. Good news is happening all around us. One of the women that came in, she once said to us, when I come here, I feel human again. What was fulfilled that day when Jesus read from the prophet Isaiah continues to be fulfilled by us who are empowered by that same Spirit. We too, as individuals and as a church, are anointed to bring good news to the poor. May God richly bless you. Thank you for all the support that you've given to me in my time at Common Table. It's appreciated. Love you.